What if a tiny group of windswept islands, thousands of miles from the world's power centers, became the center of a war that changed to nations forever? This is not just a story of territory, it's a story of pride, people, and the price of conflict. The Falklands War of 1982 was a military conflict that took place between Argentina and the United Kingdom. It began because of a long-standing dispute over the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands, a remote group of islands in the South Atlantic Ocean. Argentina has claimed the islands, which they call Islas Malvinas, since the early 19th century, arguing that they inherited them from Spain after gaining independence. However, the United Kingdom had maintained control over the islands since 1833 and considered them a British overseas territory. The disagreement had simmered for years, but tensions rose sharply in the early 1980s due to internal issues in Argentina, including economic difficulties and political unrest under a military dictatorship. In an effort to rally national support and assert sovereignty, the Argentine government decided to launch a military invasion of the islands. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces landed on the Falklands and quickly overwhelmed the small British garrison stationed there. The seizure of the islands triggered a strong response from the United Kingdom, which viewed the action as an invasion of British territory. The British government, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, organized a naval task force to sail over 8,000 miles to the South Atlantic to retake the islands. This marked the beginning of a dramatic and intense conflict that would draw international attention. The war became not just about territory, but about national pride, military strategy, and political survival on both sides. While it was relatively short in duration, lasting about 10 weeks, the conflict would leave a lasting mark on the history and politics of both nations. The origins of the war lie deeply in colonial legacies, national identity, and geopolitical tensions, making it far more than just a battle over land. Argentina's claim to the Falkland Islands is rooted in its historical ties to the Spanish Empire, from which it gained independence in the early 19th century. The Argentine government argues that when it became independent from Spain, it inherited all territories that had been under Spanish rule, including the Falkland Islands. In 1820, Argentina formally declared sovereignty over the islands and even established a small settlement there. However, in 1833, British forces arrived and took control of the islands, removing the Argentine presence and establishing their own administration. Since then, the islands have remained under continuous British control, with the United Kingdom asserting its sovereignty over them as part of its overseas territories. This act has long been viewed by Argentina as a colonial imposition and an injustice that has never been resolved. Over the decades, Argentina has consistently maintained its claim to the islands through diplomatic channels, international forums, and public rhetoric. The issue is deeply embedded in the national identity and political discourse of Argentina, often symbolizing resistance to foreign dominance and the aspiration to reclaim what many citizens see as rightfully theirs. For the British, however, the islands have been administered without interruption for generations, and the current residents, mostly of British descent, overwhelmingly identify as British and support continued British sovereignty. This difference in historical perspective and national identity has made the conflict especially sensitive and complex. International law does not clearly favor either side, as it involves questions of self-determination, colonial legacy, and territorial integrity. The result is a long-standing diplomatic impasse, with both countries holding firm to their narratives. The deep-rooted nature of the disagreement means that even decades after the conflict, emotions still run high when the topic arises in either nation, and the issue remains unresolved despite various attempts at negotiation. On April 2, 1982, Argentina launched a surprise military operation to seize control of the Falkland Islands, marking the beginning of the Falklands War. The decision to invade came from Argentina's ruling military, which was facing increasing domestic pressure due to economic hardship, political unrest, and widespread dissatisfaction among the population. The junta believed that taking back the islands would unite the country behind a patriotic cause and distract from internal problems. The operation was swift and relatively bloodless at the outset. Argentine forces landed on the islands and quickly overpowered the small contingent of British Royal Marines stationed there. The British governor was forced to surrender, and Argentine troops raised their flag over the capital. Stanley. Argentina justified the invasion by citing its historical claim to the islands and its belief that the British had unlawfully occupied them since 1833. For many Argentines, the move was seen as a long overdue act of reclaiming national territory. The news of the invasion was met with celebrations in Argentina, and the government initially experienced a surge in public support. However, the invasion also shocked the international community and provoked a strong response from the United Kingdom. The British government, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, viewed the action as an unprovoked and illegal occupation of British territory. Within days of the invasion, Britain began mobilizing a naval task force to sail to the South Atlantic and retake the islands. The Argentine leadership underestimated both the British military response and the level of international support the United Kingdom would receive. They believed that once in control of the islands, their sovereignty would be accepted or at least tolerated. However, their action had the opposite effect, setting the stage for a full-scale military conflict that would test the resolve and capabilities of both nations in the weeks ahead. In response to Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands, the United Kingdom quickly assembled and dispatched a large naval task force to the South Atlantic. Despite the great distance of over 8,000 miles from home, the decision was made rapidly by the British government, determined to defend what it considered sovereign territory and to uphold the principle that aggression could not be rewarded. The task force included aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, submarines, logistics ships, and around 28,000 troops. It was one of the most ambitious military operations mounted by the UK since the Second World War. The British also established an air bridge to Ascension Island, a key base located halfway to the Falklands, which was used to refuel aircraft and support long-range operations. As the task force approached the islands, the British imposed a maritime exclusion zone around the Falklands to restrict Argentine naval movement and to assert control over the contested area. Tensions escalated rapidly once British forces began engaging Argentine positions. One of the most notable early actions was the sinking of the Argentine cruiser, ARA, General Belgrano, by the British submarine, HMS Conqueror. This event resulted in significant Argentine casualties and was highly controversial, but it had the strategic effect of forcing the Argentine Navy to retreat to port for the remainder of the war. In retaliation, Argentine aircraft launched multiple attacks on the British fleet, including Exocet missile strikes that sank several British ships, such as HMS Sheffield and the supply ship Atlantic Conveyor. Land battles were also intense and difficult due to the harsh terrain and cold weather. British forces conducted amphibious landings at San Carlos and advanced toward Port Stanley, engaging Argentine troops in fierce combat. These land, sea, and air battles demonstrated the high cost of reclaiming the islands and the complex nature of modern warfare far from home soil. The Falklands War lasted for approximately 10 weeks, beginning with Argentina's invasion on April 2, 1982, and ending with its surrender on June 14, 1982. During this period, British forces carried out a carefully coordinated campaign involving naval blockades, airstrikes, and ground operations. After securing key beachheads at San Carlos on the eastern side of East Falkland, British troops began a steady advance toward Port Stanley, the capital of the islands and the center of Argentine control. The terrain was rugged, the weather was harsh, and the logistical challenges were immense. But the British forces adapted quickly and pushed forward with determination. Major battles took place at locations such as Goose, Green, Mount Harriet, and Mount Tumbledown, where British paratroopers and commandos faced heavily entrenched Argentine forces. The fighting was intense and often conducted at night, with soldiers enduring freezing temperatures, rough landscapes, and the constant threat of artillery or air attacks. Despite being thousands of miles from home, British troops demonstrated a high level of discipline, and their commanders executed strategic maneuvers to isolate and weaken Argentine positions. On the other hand, Argentine soldiers, many of whom were young conscripts with limited training, struggled with poor equipment, low morale, and difficult supply conditions. As the British gained control of high ground and key routes, it became clear that Argentine forces were being pushed back and losing the ability to hold Port Stanley. By mid-June, British troops had surrounded the town and launched their final assaults on the remaining Argentine defensive lines. Faced with overwhelming pressure and deteriorating conditions, Argentine Commander General Mario Menendez agreed to a ceasefire and surrendered unconditionally on June 14. The war officially ended with British forces regaining full control over the islands, marking a clear military victory for the United Kingdom and a dramatic conclusion to a brief but costly conflict. The aftermath of the Falklands War brought significant political consequences for both Argentina and the United Kingdom. In Argentina, the defeat shattered the credibility of the ruling military junta, which had already been facing growing public discontent due to economic instability, human rights abuses, and authoritarian rule. The war had been intended by the junta as a unifying distraction, but the rapid and public military failure only intensified demands for change. Massive protests erupted across Argentina, with citizens blaming the government for the reckless decision to go to war and for the needless loss of Argentine lives. Within a year of the war's end, the military dictatorship collapsed, paving the way for democratic elections in 1983. This marked a turning point in Argentina's political history, as the country began its transition back to civilian rule and the restoration of democratic institutions after years of military control. In the United Kingdom, the war had the opposite effect politically. The swift and decisive victory greatly boosted the popularity of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, whose leadership during the conflict was seen as strong and resolute. Before the war, her government had been struggling with low approval ratings and economic challenges. But the success in the South Atlantic rallied national pride and helped secure a landslide victory for her Conservative Party in the 1983 general elections. The war reinforced Britain's commitment to its overseas territories and demonstrated its willingness to defend them militarily, even over great distances. On the diplomatic front, relations between Argentina and the United Kingdom remained tense for years, with both sides maintaining their claims to the Falklands. While the war resolved the immediate military situation, it did not bring about a permanent solution to the sovereignty dispute, which continues to be a sensitive and unresolved issue in international relations to this day. The story of the Argentine War, or the Falklands War, is a reminder of how deeply nations can be shaped by history, identity, and the desire to be heard. What began as a territorial dispute became a military conflict that changed governments, lives, and global perspectives. It showed us the human cost of war-young soldiers in unfamiliar lands, families waiting for news, and leaders facing the consequences of their decisions. Yet it also taught lessons: the value of diplomacy, the importance of listening to voices on all sides, and the need to resolve disputes with understanding rather than force. Even today, the echoes of that short but intense war remind us how powerful stories, wounds, and hopes can be in shaping a nation's path. And while borders and flags may divide, the human experiences beneath them often unite us more than we realize.